First reading is a reading from the book of the prophet Isaiah. For Zion's sake, I will not be silent. For Jerusalem's sake, I will not be quiet, until her integrity shines forth like the dawn, and her victory like a burning torch. Nations shall behold your vindication, and all the rulers your glory. You shall be called by a new name, pronounced by the mouth of God. You shall be a garland of beauty in Yahweh's hands, a royal crown held by your God. No more shall people call you forsaken, or your land desolate, but you shall be called my delight, and your land espoused. For God delights in you, and your land will be joined with God in wedlock. For just as a young couple marries, you will be forever married to this land, and as a newly married couple rejoices over each other, so shall your God rejoice in you. The word of God. Today's psalm response is, proclaim God's marvelous deeds to the nations. Proclaim God's marvelous deeds to the nations. Sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord, all you lands. Sing to the Lord, bless God's name. Proclaim God's marvelous deeds to the nations. Announce God's salvation day after day. Tell God's glory among the nations. Among all peoples, God's wondrous deeds. Proclaim God's marvelous deeds to the nations. Give to the Lord, you families of nations. Give to the Lord glory and praise. Give to the Lord the glory due God's name. Proclaim God's marvelous deeds to the nations. Worship God in holy attire. Tremble before God, all the earth. Say among the nations, the Lord is God. God governs the peoples with equity. Proclaim God's wondrous deeds to the nations.
Today's second reading on this second Sunday of Ordinary Time is from the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians. Brothers and sisters, there are different kinds of spiritual gifts, but the same Spirit. There are different forms of service, but the same Lord. There are different workings, but the same God, who produces all of them in everyone. To each individual, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. To one is given the gift to speak, wisdom through the Spirit. To another, the expression of knowledge according to the same Spirit. Others are given the gift of faith. And by the same Spirit, some are given the gifts of healing. One works miracles, and another utters prophecy, while still others are given the gift to discern spirits. Some are given the gift of tongues, and others the gift to interpret them. But one and the same Spirit produces all of these, distributing them individually to each person as the Spirit wills. The word of God.
The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. There was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the wedding. When the wine ran short, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, how does your concern affect me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servers, "Do whatever he tells you." Now, there were 6 stone water jars there for Jewish ceremonial washings, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus told them, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Draw some out now and take it to the head waiter." So they took it. When the head waiter tasted the water that had become wine, without knowing where it came from, although the servers who had drawn the water knew, the head waiter called the bride and groom and said, "Everyone serves good wine first, and then when people have drunk freely, an inferior one. But you have kept the good wine until now." This, the first of his signs, Jesus at Cana in Galilee, and so revealed his glory, and his disciples began to believe in him. The Gospel of the Lord. Again, good morning. At my fairly seasoned age, I've never lived a single day at the same time as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I was born almost a year to the day after Dr. King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. Therefore, when I think about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy and his influence on my life, I find it most meaningful to contextualize my perceptions in important facts and historical records that relate to his time on this earth, as opposed to the lionized, almost mythical depictions that predominate any discussion of the man today. More than 50 years after his death, what was the climate in which Dr. King operated? And how does it relate to what we experience today? I remind myself that although revered today, according to an early 1968 Harris poll, the man whose 57 years of martyrdom we celebrate this week died with a public disapproval rating of nearly 75%. I remind myself, too, that the current overly narrow focus on King's legacy that we have today, that is, the focus on his countless confrontations with vicious, inflammatory bigots and his soaring oratory on August 28, 1963, at the Lincoln Memorial about achieving a dream, serves the purpose of deflecting focus from some of the more radical notions of equity that led to Dr. King's high disapproval ratings at the time of his death. Dr. Cornel West calls this whitewashing of King's legacy the Santa Clausification of Martin Luther King Jr. Finally, I remind myself of the courage of King's conviction and commitment to nonviolence, especially in the face of the violence that not only encompassed his death at the hands of an assassin, but predominated his everyday existence, not just as a Black man in America, but also as someone who would dare challenge the imperialism, colonialism, and economic injustice endemic to this nation. While some may erroneously believe that nonviolence, particularly King's brand of nonviolence, entails the absence of doing something, nonviolence is not at its core about what not to do. It is about what you are going to do about the violence and injustice in our own hearts, our homes, our neighborhoods, and our society at large. It's about taking a proactive and, yes, often provocative stand against violence and injustice. Those practicing nonviolence do not fly under the radar. Just like combating hate requires a commitment to enacting love, the violence that it overwhelmingly perpetrated against African Americans and the less economically powerful has always required an equal measure and commitment to nonviolence. Especially as an elected official, what does that look like in a day when the systems that enact that violence have evolved to the point that merely operating within those systems invites complicity with them? The answer to that question has a lot to do with how we engage with those systems that King failed to push toward the equitable ideal that King knew they should be. White racial resentment was still a critical factor between 1963 and 1968 when Dr. Martin Luther King's unfavorable numbers surged 25 points higher. But King's escalating disapproval ratings were not just about his notoriety among the power structures that upheld Jim Crow. By 1968, he had largely dismantled Jim Crow and rallied the nation against institutionalized racial persecution in the South. King's faltering appeal over the final years of his life was in part a consequence of his condemnation of American militarism and gross disparities in wealth and opportunity. These are the parts of King's legacy that remain unfinished, and the parts upon which I focus in honor of his legacy. At the time of his death, King was making a straightforward call for an active, multiracial coalition of have-nots that was terrifying to white ruling elites. In his own words, King had abandoned the incremental approach to social change of his civil rights protest days in favor of pursuing, quote, a reconstruction of the entire society, a revolution of values, end quote. One which, quote, would look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth with righteous indignation, end quote. When King decried the hypocrisy of sending young Black men 8,000 miles to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia or East Harlem, he criticized not just the Jim Crow South, but the entirety of America. When King tried to persuade whites outside the South to share their neighborhoods and jobs with Blacks, or to support expensive federal assistance programs dedicated to helping Blacks overcome the historic disadvantages imposed on them by whites of earlier generations, he challenged segregation throughout all of America. If these themes sound vaguely familiar, it's because they remain injustices that we are combating to this day. The reason that I know that these are the unfinished parts of King's legacy is that not only do the injustices King spoke of stubbornly remain in place, but they also remain unpopular topics of conversation. Some of the most vitriolic and pushbacks and recriminations that I have received as an elected official have been when I took a stance in support of voting rights, particularly the voting rights of Blacks. As recently as 2 years ago, voting districts for Monroe County were racially gerrymandered, with Black voters concentrated into some voting districts to dilute their voting influence, and elsewhere, Black voters split across other districts to ensure that they would be consistently outvoted. In Monroe County, that meant that in a city that is 42% Black and a county that is 16% Black, there were only 2 majority Black voting districts out of 29 total. To this day, Black voters, through segregationist housing practices, remain concentrated into parts of the city we refer to as the Crescent. The name has derogatory history and origin, referencing the high rate of murders and proximate violence that plagued the community. The Crescent harkens to the same Jim Crow sensibility that Dr. King fought in the South, but it is a reality today in Monroe County. Reclaiming that Crescent appellation for good, I joined in coalition with predominantly Black organizations, including members of the Divine Nine sorority organizations like the Delta Sigma Theta Social Justice Team, the Urban League, the NAACP, and Black faith leaders, including Spark and Spiritus Christi's own Reverend Myra Free the Black Vote Brown. We called ourselves the Crescent Map Coalition, and we stood steadfast in the fight against Jim Crow-era voting districts in Monroe County. Heartbreakingly, predominantly white social justice organizations largely sat on the sidelines during this fight, claiming not to understand the issue sufficiently to advocate for a fair number of Black voting districts. Even the Democratic caucus of the Monroe County Legislature, despite knowing the harm of disenfranchisement that was being visited on Black voters, preferred maps that continue to subject Black voters to a Jim Crow existence. What's even more disappointing is that members of the Democratic caucus hid behind other marginalized groups to carry the water of white supremacy and enforce a racial hierarchy that kept Black voters at the bottom. It reminded me powerfully of Dr. Martin Luther King's words explaining how racism thrives on false narratives that negatively depict Black communities. King said, "Somebody told a lie one day. They couched it in language. They made everything Black ugly and evil. Look in your dictionary and see the synonyms of the word Black. It's always something degrading, low, and sinister. Look at the word white. It's always something pure, high, clean. Thus, society overtly and subtly teaches us to have disdain for Black culture, Black identities, and Black civil rights. Racial disparities are connected to those lies, which are meant to create a permanent underclass descended from enslaved and colonized Africans. Ultimately, I was one of the few local elected officials to defend the rights of African Americans under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And by filing a lawsuit, we got a concession of not 5, but 6 majority Black voting districts. What's even better is that the arguments that we made to secure those Black voting districts were recently affirmed by the US Supreme Court in Alabama v. Milligan. But that's just one example of the type of courageous and compassionate commitment to the beloved community that has and will continue to be the hallmark of my service and the legacy of King. That's also where courage in the face of violence comes in. Structural injustice is violence. We can see its toll reflected in life expectancy rates, in disparate measures of health and well-being, in disproportionate physical suffering and unequal economic insecurity, in higher rates of police brutality, in housing discrimination, and in economic and voting disenfranchisement. The reality is that a commitment to taking a stand against the violence and injustice, particularly state-sponsored violence, and fighting that injustice and working to address the harm that injustice has wrought requires an incredible amount of courage. Again, nonviolence is not about doing nothing. It is about doing something. Engaging in nonviolent action to fight for justice and the beloved community is an act of courage in the face of violence. The threat of violence that Martin Luther King Jr. faced in his time was considerable, to say the least, and was obviously proved in the grim end that he met at the hands of an assassin. I would like to say that threats to our person as African Americans who buck the status quo and demand the same type of racial and equity-minded reckoning sought by King were a thing of the past. While perhaps more subtle, unfortunately for those of us who continue to demand accountability from institutions and systems that wage disproportionate harm on Black people, the threats remain palpable. According to the Women's Democracy Lab and the Brennan Centers for Justice, about half of the women who ran for local office said that they are less likely to run for re-election due to the threats made to their personal safety that they experienced while in office. For BIPOC women, that number approaches 90%. There's an additional burden that accompanies public service in support of equity for Black people. The unpopularity of centering the human rights of the most marginalized is precisely why we must focus on that unfinished part of King's legacy. To me, just like the fight for Black voting rights, the level of pushback in service to the human rights of the most marginalized serves as a barometer, a gauge, for whether the person being criticized is advocating for truly anti-racist, equity-based practice or policy. Remember that a commitment to nonviolence involves being willing to sacrifice reputation and popularity. Maintaining silence is complicity in the face of an unequal and unjust status quo. But it will allow one to escape the most severe and poignant pushback. In my understanding of the legacy of King, if I weren't being criticized from within the structures that support racial inequity, I would worry that I am not engaging sufficiently in the work to advance the legacy of King. As Frederick Douglass said so eloquently, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. And if the establishment that upholds injustice is not threatened, or at least made a little bit uncomfortable by the demands that I am making of it, then I am not adequately advocating for the structural changes that King sought later in his lifetime. The beautiful thing about nonviolent resistance is that we all have the physical capacity to engage in it. The ultimate question, however, is whether we have the strength of will and the courage of conviction to commit to it, as did King, as a practice, a daily practice in how we live our lives. So I leave you with this question on this day and weekend when we are commemorating the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. What have you done today in the name of nonviolent resistance to advance King's legacy? Thank you.
Love you, Lord, for your mercy never failed me. All my days I've been held in your hand. Every moment when I wake up, when I lay my head, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. For all my life you have been faithful.
Yes, Myra, yes.
And all my life you have been so, so good. And every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. I love your voice, for you led me through the fire in darkest nights, close like no other. For I've known you as a father, I've known you as a friend. Oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you've been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. Every breath that I am, oh, I will sing Oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. I will sing of the goodness of God.